When my daughter shouted, "You will either serve my husband, or you can pack your bags and leave," I did not respond in anger. Instead, I smiled, took my suitcase, and walked out, leaving behind the house I had paid for with my wife. She expected me to beg as usual, but this time everything was about to change. A week later, my phone was flooded with 22 missed calls, and that was just the beginning. They had no idea what was coming for them. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. If you've ever experienced family drama, betrayal, or dreamed of sweet revenge, this story is for you. My name is Clark Miller, and for most of my life, I believed in the power of family. I grew up in a small Montana town where everyone knew your name and your reputation was as valuable as your word. I worked 30 years at the local bank, raised my daughter Tiffany with all the love and patience I could muster. And after my wife Martha passed away, I poured everything I had left into making sure Tiffany never felt the sting of loss or struggle. Tiffany was my only child, the light of my life. She was bright, ambitious, and stubborn, traits she inherited from her mother. When she met Harry, I was cautious but supportive. Harry was charming in that way some men are, all easy smiles and big promises. He worked at the local auto dealership, always talking about his plans to move up, to provide for Tiffany, to build a future. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that my daughter had chosen well. When they got married, I paid for the wedding $25,000 for the reception. The dress, the flowers, everything Tiffany wanted. Harry's family couldn't afford their share, so I covered it quietly, not wanting to embarrass anyone. That's what fathers do, I told myself. That's what Martha would have wanted. After the wedding, they struggled to buy a house. The market was tough, and their savings were thin. So I dipped into my retirement, $80,000 for the down payment on a modest 3-bedroom on Pine Street. I told myself it was an investment in their future, a way to keep family close. I even put the house in my name just in case they need to help with the mortgage. I never imagined that decision would become the center of a family conflict that would tear us apart. For 5 years, I paid the mortgage, the utilities, even groceries when money got tight. My Social Security check disappeared into their lives piece by piece. I convinced myself it was love, that I was doing the right thing. But as the years passed, I noticed changes. Harry became more demanding, less grateful. Tiffany, once so affectionate, started siding with him in every argument. Little things like Harry taking my favorite chair, or Tiffany rolling her eyes when I asked about their finances began to add up. Still, I tried to ignore the signs. I told myself it was just the stress of young marriage, that things would get better. I wanted to believe that family meant something, that my sacrifices were appreciated. But deep down, I felt the sting of broken trust, the slow erosion of respect. One Saturday afternoon, I came home from the grocery store, arms full of bags, wrists aching from the weight. I found Harry sprawled in my leather recliner, Martha's last gift to me before the cancer took her. His feet were up, a half-empty beer bottle dangling from his fingers, the remote resting on his belly like he owned the place. He didn't even look up. "Grab me another beer from the fridge while you're up," he said, eyes glued to the basketball game. I set the bags down, feeling the plastic handles dig into my palms. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You heard me," Harry replied, not even glancing my way. "Corona? Not that cheap stuff you drink." I'd bought those Coronas for him, spent my own money on beer I'd never touch. Something cold settled in my chest. "Harry, I just walked in. I need to put these groceries away." Now he looked at me, his face carrying that familiar expression, the one that said I was being unreasonable, difficult. "What's the big deal? You're already standing." "I'm comfortable." "The big deal is that this is my house," I wanted to say. But before I could, Tiffany appeared in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice carrying that warning tone I remembered from her teenage years. "Your father's being difficult," Harry said, still not looking at me. "I asked him to get me a beer, and he's making it into some kind of federal case." Tiffany looked at me with disappointment, like I was a child acting out. "Dad, just get him the beer. It's not worth fighting over." I felt a wave of humiliation, a sting sharper than any argument. My own daughter, siding with her husband, treating me like a servant in the house I'd paid for. I swallowed my pride, grabbed a beer from the fridge and handed it to Harry. He took it without a word, eyes back on the game. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. I thought about all the times I'd bailed them out, all the sacrifices I'd made. I wondered when I'd stopped being a father and started being a doormat. But little did they know, I wasn't going to stay broken for long. The days that followed that humiliating Saturday blurred together, each one a little heavier than the last, as if the air in my own home had thickened with disappointment and resentment. I tried to convince myself that things would get better, that Tiffany would remember the father who'd carried her on his shoulders through county fairs and snowstorms, who'd stayed up late helping her with homework, who'd never missed a single school play or parent-teacher conference. But the warmth between us had cooled, replaced by a brittle politeness that cracked every time Harry entered the room. He strutted around the house like he owned it, leaving dirty dishes in the sink, tracking mud across the floors Martha and I had refinished together, and barking orders at me as if I were the hired help. The family drama that had once been confined to whispered arguments behind closed doors now spilled out into the open, poisoning every meal, every conversation, every quiet moment. I watched as Tiffany's laughter faded, replaced by a tightness around her eyes and a sharpness in her voice that I barely recognized. She snapped at me for the smallest things, forgetting to buy her favorite cereal, leaving the porch light on, asking about her day. It was as if my very presence had become an inconvenience, a reminder of obligations she no longer wanted to honor. The betrayal was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew with every passing week. I started to notice the way Harry would glance at Tiffany before answering my questions, as if waiting for her approval to speak. I saw the way she deferred to him, letting him make decisions about the house, the bills, even the food we ate. My role in their lives had shrunk to that of a silent benefactor, a walking checkbook whose opinions no longer mattered. The final straw came one rainy evening when I overheard them arguing in the kitchen. Harry's voice was low and urgent, Tiffany sharp and defensive. "He's not going to be around forever," Harry muttered. "We need to start thinking about our future. The house should be in our name, not his." Tiffany hesitated, her voice trembling. "He's my father, he's done everything for us, and he'll keep doing it," Harry replied, "as long as you let him. But we can't build our life on his charity. We need control." The words stung, not just because of their content, but because of the cold calculation behind them. I realized then that Harry saw me not as family, but as an obstacle that needed to be removed for his plans to succeed. The next day, I stopped by the bank to check on some paperwork, and Bob Harrison, an old friend from my banking days, pulled me aside. "Clark, I probably shouldn't say anything, but I thought you should know Harry came in here last month trying to take out a home equity loan. Claimed he owned your house, brought in some paperwork, but it didn't check out. Looked like he'd forged your signature." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Harry hadn't just disrespected me. He tried to steal from me. My own son-in-law, the man I'd welcomed to my family, was willing to commit fraud to get his hands on more money. And Tiffany? She must have known. There was no way she could be that blind. I left the bank in a daze, my mind racing. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial, legal, and deeply personal. I'd spent years supporting them, paying their bills, covering their debts, and this was how they repaid me? With lies, manipulation, and outright theft? That night, I listened to the quiet hum of the house and felt a cold anger settle in my chest. This wasn't just a toxic relationship, it was a full-blown family conflict. The kind you read about in pro-revenge stories on Reddit. I realized I'd been living in denial, clinging to the hope that things would get better, that Tiffany would come to her senses. But now, the truth was impossible to ignore. The next day, I drove past my old house. My house. I saw Harry's truck in the driveway, Tiffany's car parked beside it. The lights were on, the curtains drawn. I wondered if they were celebrating, thinking they'd finally gotten rid of the old man who kept asking questions about money. I wondered if they felt any guilt, any shame, or if they were just relieved to have the place to themselves. I parked across the street and watched for a while, hidden behind the tinted windows of my Buick. I saw Harry come out onto the porch, beer in hand, laughing into his phone. Tiffany followed, her face tight with worry, glancing up and down the street as if she expected me to show up and cause a scene. But I didn't. I just watched, my anger simmering beneath the surface. That night, The missed calls started. At first, just one or two. Tiffany, probably wondering where I'd gone, if I was coming back. Then more as the days passed. By the end of the week, there were 22 missed calls, each one a reminder of the broken trust the shattered family had left behind. But little did they know, I wasn't going to stay broken for long. I was done being the victim in this story. If they wanted to see what real payback looked like, they were about to get a front row seat. For days, I drifted through a fog of disbelief and anger, haunted by the reality of my daughter's betrayal and the toxic family drama that had become my life. I replayed every moment, every sacrifice, every time I put their needs above my own, only to be cast aside like an inconvenience. The motel room felt smaller with each passing hour, the silence pressing in on me, demanding that I face the truth. I was no longer welcome in the home I'd built, the home I'd paid for. The home where every wall echoed with memories of Martha and the little girl Tiffany used to be. But as the hours turned into days, something inside me shifted. The pain of betrayal began to harden into resolve. I realized I'd spent years enabling their entitlement, mistaking my generosity for love, letting them bleed me dry while they built their lives on my back. I thought about all the pro-revenge stories I'd read online, the ones where justice is served not with violence, but with patience and cunning. I thought about karma, about how it always finds a way to balance the scales, and I knew it was time to stop waiting for someone else to save me. I was done being the victim in this family conflict. I was done letting Harry and Tiffany write the story of my life. That night, I sat at the tiny motel desk, surrounded by stacks of bank statements, insurance policies, and legal documents. Years of careful record-keeping that had once been my way of protecting them, now my arsenal for reclaiming my dignity. I started making lists, mapping out every account, every payment, every thread that tied me to their lives. I realized just how much power I still held, how many ways I could pull the rug out from under them without ever raising my voice. The more I planned, the more the anger faded, replaced by a cold, focused determination. I wasn't just going to walk away, I was going to make sure they felt the consequences of their actions, that they understood what it meant to lose the safety net they'd taken for granted. I began by reviewing every automatic payment I'd set up for Tiffany and Harry. The mortgage, the utilities, the car insurance, the credit cards where Tiffany was an authorized user. I'd been the silent engine behind their comfortable life, the invisible hand that kept the lights on and the bills paid, all in the name of family. But now, every account was a lever I could pull, every payment a thread I could cut. I called the bank first, my voice steady as I explained that the automatic mortgage payments for 847 Pine Street would be discontinued immediately. The representative hesitated, surprised by the sudden change after 5 years of reliability. But I insisted, my tone leaving no room for argument. Next, I contacted the insurance company, removing both their vehicles from my policy, forcing them to face the reality of adult responsibility. The credit cards were more complicated, but I methodically removed Tiffany as an authorized user, blocking her from making any new charges and ensuring that any outstanding balances would be her problem, not mine. Each call felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a small but satisfying act of petty revenge that chipped away at the foundation of their entitlement. I kept meticulous notes, confirmation numbers, effective dates, every detail logged in a notebook that had once tracked their expenses. Now, a record of my liberation. But I didn't stop there. I started gathering evidence of Harry's attempted fraud. The forged documents he'd brought to the bank, the whispers about his gambling debts that had reached even the quiet corners of our small town. I spoke with Bob Harrison again, securing copies of the paperwork Harry had tried to use to steal my house, and reached out to Detective Morrison, an old friend from church, to make sure the authorities were aware of Harry's activities. I even filed the eviction notice at the courthouse, citing breach of verbal agreement and lack of respect as grounds for removing them from my property. Every step was deliberate, every action legal and above board. The kind of pro-revenge story that would make any reader on Reddit nod in approval. But I kept my moves quiet, letting the tension build, knowing that the real impact wouldn't be felt until the payments stopped, the bills arrived, and the safety net vanished. I imagined the look on Harry's face when the mortgage bounced, the panic in Tiffany's voice when the insurance lapsed, the confusion as their world began to unravel. I was careful, methodical, never letting anger cloud my judgment. This was about justice, about showing them the true cost of betrayal, about making sure karma did its work. But when the day finally came, everything changed. The day the first mortgage payment bounced, the storm truly began, and I watched it unfold from a distance with a strange sense of calm satisfaction. I was sitting in the corner booth at Annie's diner, sipping black coffee and watching the world go by, when my phone started buzzing with frantic calls from Tiffany. I let them go to voicemail, each one more desperate than the last. By noon, Harry was calling too, his messages shifting from confusion to anger to outright panic. The bank had sent a foreclosure warning, the insurance company had canceled their policies, and the credit card companies were demanding immediate payment. Their carefully constructed life was collapsing, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. But I wasn't finished. I made sure the community knew the truth. Quiet conversations at the hardware store, a word with Pastor Williams at church, a few facts shared with neighbors who'd always wondered how Tiffany and Harry managed to live so well. The story spread like wildfire. The old man who'd paid for everything. The daughter and son-in-law who'd repaid him with betrayal and greed. Even Harry's boss at the auto dealership heard the rumors, and within days, Harry was called in and let go, his reputation in tatters. The final blow came when the sheriff's deputy served them the eviction notice, right there on the front porch for all the neighbors to see. Tiffany called me in tears, begging for another chance, but I kept my voice calm and steady, reminding her of the ultimatum she'd given me. "You wanted me gone, Tiffany? Now you get to see what life is like without me." Harry tried to confront me at the motel, but the manager called the police and he was warned to stay away. The satisfaction was bittersweet. Years of emotional storytelling, family drama, and broken trust had led to this moment, and now justice was finally being served. But the story wasn't over yet. As the days passed, the consequences of their actions rippled outward. The bank moved forward with foreclosure proceedings, and the sheriff's office made it clear that Harry and Tiffany had no legal claim to the property. Their credit was ruined, their reputation shredded, and the whispers in church pews and grocery store aisles followed them everywhere. Harry's gambling debts caught up with him, and soon enough, debt collectors were knocking on their door, demanding payment for loans he'd hidden from Tiffany. She called me again, her voice trembling, asking if there was any way to fix what had happened, if I can help him just one more time. But I learned my lesson: enabling toxic relationships only leads to more pain. I told her, gently but firmly, that I hoped she would find her own strength, that sometimes karma is the only teacher that works. I moved into a small lakeside cabin, a place filled with peace and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd finally stood up for myself. I spent my mornings fishing, my afternoons reading, and my evenings watching the sun set over the water, free from the weight of family conflict and betrayal. The community, once divided, now rallied around me, offering support and understanding. Even Tiffany, after months of struggle, began to rebuild her life, this time on her own terms, without Harry's shadow looming over her. As for Harry, he eventually left town, chased by creditors and the consequences and his own choices. Looking back, I realized that true justice isn't about revenge for its own sake. It's about reclaiming your dignity, setting boundaries, and letting those who wronged you face the results of their actions. Justice served, karma delivered, and a new chapter began. But just as I thought the dust had settled, a letter arrived at my cabin, one that would force me to confront the past all over again. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unmistakably Tiffany's, shaky, uncertain, but still my daughter's. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. Inside was a letter that spilled out more than just words. It was a confession, an apology, and a desperate plea for understanding. Tiffany wrote about the toxic relationship she'd been trapped in, the way Harry's betrayal had poisoned her view of family, and how she'd let her own bitterness blind her to the truth. She admitted she'd known about some of Harry's gambling, but not the full extent of his debts or the lies he'd told to keep her compliant. She described the shame she felt every time she saw a neighbor cross the street to avoid her, the humiliation of being the subject of every whispered conversation in town. She wrote about the day the sheriff came to serve the eviction notice, how she'd watched from behind the curtains as Harry raged and cursed, blaming everyone but himself. She confessed that she'd thought about leaving him, but fear and pride had kept her rooted in place. The letter was raw, filled with regret and longing for the days when our family had been whole. She asked if there was any way back, any path to forgiveness, or if the damage was simply too great. Reading her words, I felt a surge of emotions, anger, sadness, and a flicker of hope. This was the kind of emotional storytelling that made every sacrifice, every heartbreak, feel both unbearable and necessary. I realized that Tiffany was finally facing the consequences of her choices. That karma was teaching her the lessons I never could. But as I folded the letter and stared out at the lake, I knew the next step would be the hardest yet. Would I open the door to reconciliation, or would I let the past remain buried? The answer, I realized, would change both our lives forever. That night, I sat on the porch of my cabin, the cool air heavy with the scent of pine and the distant sound of loons calling across the lake. I turned Tiffany's letter over in my hands, reading and rereading her words, searching for sincerity between the lines. The pain of betrayal still burned, but beneath it, I sensed a genuine desire for redemption. A daughter finally waking up to the reality of her own actions. I thought about all the revenge stories I'd read, the ones where justice served meant cutting ties forever, but I also knew that real life was messier than any pro-revenge tale. Family conflicts don't end with a single act of payback. They linger, reshaping the people involved in ways that can't always be predicted. I remembered the look on Tiffany's face the last time I saw her, a mixture of defiance and fear, and wondered if she was truly ready to face the truth about herself and Harry. The next morning I called her. My voice was steady, but my heart raced as I listened to her answer, her words tumbling out in a rush of relief and anxiety. We agreed to meet at the old diner in town, the same place where I'd once taken her for ice cream after school, back when life was simple and trust was unbroken. As I drove into town, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. Years of enabling, of hoping for change, of watching my family drama play out like a slow-motion car crash. I parked outside the diner, took a deep breath, and walked inside, unsure of what I'd find. Kathleen was already there, sitting in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who believed her father could fix anything. But now the roles were reversed. She needed to fix what she'd broken, to prove that she was more than the sum of her mistakes. As we sat across from each other, the tension was thick, every word heavy with years of unspoken pain. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." But apologies were only the beginning. The real test was still to come. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unmistakably Tiffany shaky, uncertain, but still my daughter's. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. Inside was a letter that spilled out more than just words. It was a confession, an apology, and a desperate plea for understanding. Tiffany wrote about the toxic relationship she'd been trapped in, the way Harry's betrayal had poisoned her view of family, and how she'd let her own bitterness blind her to the truth. She admitted she'd known about some of Harry's gambling, but not the full extent of his debts or the lies he'd told to keep her compliant. She described the shame she felt every time she saw a neighbor cross the street to avoid her, the humiliation of being the subject of every whispered conversation in town. She wrote about the day the sheriff came to serve the eviction notice, how she'd watched from behind the curtains as Harry raged and cursed, blaming everyone but himself. She confessed that she'd thought about leaving him, but fear and pride had kept her rooted in place. The letter was raw, filled with regret and longing for the days when our family had been whole. She asked if there was any way back, any path to forgiveness, or if the damage was simply too great. Reading her words, I felt a surge of emotions, anger, sadness, and a flicker of hope. This was the kind of emotional storytelling that made every sacrifice, every heartbreak, feel both unbearable and necessary. I realized that Tiffany was finally facing the consequences of her choices. That karma was teaching her the lessons I never could. But as I folded the letter and stared out at the lake, I knew the next step would be the hardest yet. Would I open the door to reconciliation, or would I let the past remain buried? The answer, I realized, would change both our lives forever. That night, I sat on the porch of my cabin, the cool air heavy with the scent of pine and the distant sound of loons calling across the lake. I turned Tiffany's letter over in my hands, reading and rereading her words, searching for sincerity between the lines. The pain of betrayal still burned, but beneath it, I sensed a genuine desire for redemption. A daughter finally waking up to the reality of her own actions. I thought about all the revenge stories I'd read, the ones where justice served meant cutting ties forever, but I also knew that real life was messier than any pro-revenge tale. Family conflicts don't end with a single act of payback. They linger, reshaping the people involved in ways that can't always be predicted. I remembered the look on Tiffany's face, the last time I saw her, a mixture of defiance and fear, and wondered if she was truly ready to face the truth about herself and Harry. The next morning I called her. My voice was steady, but my heart raced as I listened to her answer, her words tumbling out in a rush of relief and anxiety. We agreed to meet at the old diner in town, the same place where I'd once taken her for ice cream after school, back when life was simple and trust was unbroken. As I drove into town, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. Years of enabling, of hoping for change, of watching my family drama play out like a slow-motion car crash. I parked outside the diner, took a deep breath, and walked inside, unsure of what I'd find. Tiffany was already there, sitting in a corner booth, her hand wrapped around a mug of coffee, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who believed her father could fix anything. But now the roles were reversed. She needed to fix what she'd broken, to prove that she was more than the sum of her mistakes. As we sat across from each other, the tension was thick, every word heavy with years of unspoken pain. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm so sorry, but apologies were only the beginning." The real test was still to come. The days that followed were a blur of headlines, phone calls, and awkward encounters in town, each one a reminder of how deeply the roots of betrayal and family conflict had grown. The local paper ran a front-page story about Harry's arrest, detailing the web of financial betrayal and fraud he'd spun not just against me, but against several other families in the area. The community, once divided by gossip and speculation, now rallied around me and Tiffany, offering support and sympathy in ways I never expected. Old friends stopped by the cabin with casseroles and kind words. Neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid us now waved from their porches, and even Pastor Williams visited to pray with us for healing and forgiveness. But the wounds of family drama ran deep. Tiffany struggled with guilt and shame, haunted by the role she'd played in enabling Harry's toxic behavior. She started attending counseling, determined to break the cycle of denial and rebuild her life on a foundation of honesty and self-respect. I watched her grow stronger each day, her confidence returning as she faced the consequences of her choices head-on. Meanwhile, Harry's world continued to unravel. He lost his job, his reputation, and eventually his freedom, sentenced to time in county jail for fraud and theft. The justice system had done its part, but the real justice, the kind that comes from within, was still unfolding. I found myself reflecting on the nature of revenge, realizing that the most satisfying stories aren't about destroying your enemies, but about reclaiming your own peace and dignity. Yet, as the dust began to settle, a letter arrived from Harry himself, scrawled in a shaky hand from his jail cell. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I was ready to face whatever final words he had for me. The letter was short, bitter, and full of blame. Harry wrote that he'd been set up, that none of this would have happened if I just kept paying the bills and minding my own business. He accused me of ruining his life, of turning the whole town against him, and of poisoning Tiffany's mind. There was no apology, no hint of remorse, just the same entitlement and resentment that had defined our toxic relationship from the start. Reading his words, I felt a strange sense of closure. For years, I'd wondered if I was too harsh, if my decision to cut them off had been an act of petty revenge rather than justice served. But now, seeing Harry's true colors in black and white, I knew I'd made the right choice. I folded the letter and tucked it away, a final piece of evidence in the long, painful story of our family drama. Tiffany, for her part, wanted nothing to do with Harry's last attempt at manipulation. She filed for divorce, determined to break free from the cycle of betrayal and start over. The process was messy, filled with legal battles and emotional scars, but through it all, she leaned on the support of friends, community, and, slowly, cautiously, me. We began to rebuild our relationship, one honest conversation at a time, learning to trust each other again after years of broken promises. But as Tiffany moved forward, she faced one last challenge, reclaiming her own sense of worth, independent of the men who had shaped her life. And as I watched her take those first steps toward healing, I realized that my own journey was far from over. Because just as we started to find our footing, a knock at my door one rainy evening brought an unexpected visitor, someone from Harry's past, holding secrets that threatened to reopen old wounds and test the fragile peace we'd built. Standing on my porch, drenched from the rain, was a woman I barely recognized, Harry's estranged sister, Melissa. She introduced herself quietly, her eyes wary but determined, and explained that she'd come not to defend her brother, but to warn me. She'd heard about the family drama and the fallout from Harry's arrest, and she wanted to set the record straight about things even Tiffany didn't know. Melissa revealed that Harry's pattern of betrayal and manipulation stretched back years, long before he'd ever met my daughter. He'd left a trail of broken trust, unpaid debts, and ruined relationships in every county he'd lived in, always moving on before the consequences caught up with him. She handed me a folder filled with documents, old court records, letters from other victims, and even a few newspaper clippings about Harry's past scams. As I flipped through the pages, the full scope of his toxic behavior became clear. It was a pro-revenge story that spanned states, a web of lies and petty revenge that had finally unraveled in her small town. Melissa apologized for not coming forward sooner, admitting that she'd been afraid of Harry's temper and ashamed of her own silence. Her visit was a reminder that the damage Harry had done wasn't limited to our family. It was part of a much larger pattern of emotional storytelling and generational conflict. As she left, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth was finally out, and sorrow for all the lives Harry had touched and tarnished. But as I closed the door behind her, I realized that one final decision still lay ahead. What to do with the evidence she'd given me, and whether to use it to help others find justice or to finally let the past rest. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the folder from Melissa spread out before me, the rain tapping steadily against the window. Each document was another piece of the puzzle, another chapter in a long saga of betrayal stories and family conflict that stretched far beyond my own experience. I thought about the other families Harry had hurt, the people who'd never gotten closure or justice served, and I felt a responsibility I hadn't expected. Part of me wanted to put it all behind me, to focus on the peace I'd finally found and let karma handle the rest. But another part, the part that had spent years watching injustice go unpunished, knew that sharing this evidence could help others heal, could bring a sense of closure to those still haunted by Harry's toxic relationships. I called Detective Morrison and explained what Melissa had given me. He listened carefully, his voice steady as he promised to reopen old cases and reach out to the other victims. The next day, I met with a few of them at the courthouse, sharing stories and offering support. It was a strange kind of family, bound not by blood, but by the scars left behind by one man's selfishness. As we talked, I realized that revenge isn't always about payback. It's about breaking the cycle, about making sure the next person doesn't have to suffer in silence. But as I left the courthouse, a familiar car pulled up beside me, and Tiffany stepped out, her face set with determination. "Dad," she said, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago." We stood in the parking lot, the autumn wind swirling leaves around our feet, as Tiffany took a deep breath and finally let the last of her secrets spill out. She confessed that, in the early days of her marriage to Harry, she'd ignored warning signs, small lies, unexplained absences, and the way he'd isolated her from friends and family. She admitted that she'd been so desperate to prove everyone wrong, to show the world that her marriage was perfect, that she turned a blind eye to the truth. "I was afraid, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "Afraid of being alone, afraid of failing, and most of all, afraid of disappointing you in Mom's memory." Her words cut deeper than any betrayal, because they revealed the emotional cost of years spent living in denial. I realized then that Tiffany's journey was its own kind of revenge story, a battle to reclaim her self-worth from the wreckage of a toxic relationship. She told me she'd started attending a support group for survivors of emotional abuse, and that she wanted to use her experience to help others trapped in similar family drama. As we hugged, I felt the last of my anger melt away, replaced by a fierce pride in my daughter's courage. But even as we began to heal, I knew that forgiveness was a process, not a destination. The scars of betrayal would always be there, but so would the lessons learned and the strength gained. As we drove home together, the sun breaking through the clouds, I realized that our story wasn't just about justice served or karma catching up to the guilty. It was about the power of truth, the resilience of family, and a hope that even the deepest wounds can one day become wisdom. Yet, as we pulled into the driveway, a letter from the Veterans Housing Initiative waited in the mailbox, hinting at a new chapter neither of us could have predicted. I opened the envelope with Tiffany by my side, and together we read the words that would change the meaning of our family home forever. The letter explained that the house, once a battleground of betrayal and family conflict, would soon become a sanctuary for 3 veteran families, each one struggling to rebuild after their own battles with loss and hardship. As I read their words, I felt a deep sense of closure, knowing that the place where so much pain had unfolded would now be a source of hope and healing for others. Tiffany squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of the past finally lift. The community gathered to celebrate, neighbors and friends coming together not to gossip, but to honor a new beginning. Even Pastor Williams offered a blessing, his words a reminder that justice served isn't always about punishment, it's about transformation, about turning pain into purpose. Tiffany and I spent that afternoon helping the new family settle in, sharing stories and laughter, the scars of our own journey slowly fading into the background. As the sun set over the lake, I realized that revenge stories and tales of karma are never really about the people who wronged us. They're about the strength it takes to reclaim your life, to set boundaries, and to choose hope over bitterness. My daughter and I had found our way back to each other, not because we forgot the past, but because we faced it together, one honest conversation at a time. And as we walked home, I turned to her and asked, "Do you think we did the right thing?" She smiled, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "We did the only thing we could." But as we closed the door behind us, I knew that our story, like all the best emotional storytelling and pro-revenge tales, would live on not just as a warning, but as a testament to the power of healing, forgiveness, and the courage to start again. That evening, as Tiffany and I sat together on the porch of my lakeside cabin, the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The laughter of children from the newly settled veteran families drifted across the water, a living reminder that the house which had once been the epicenter of our family Drama was now a place of hope and new beginnings. We talked quietly about the journey we'd taken. The betrayals, the heartbreak, the moments when it seemed like the weight of broken trust would crush us both. Tiffany admitted that she still had nightmares about Harry, about the way he'd manipulated her and tried to turn her against me. But she also spoke of the strength she'd found in facing the truth and refusing to let her past define her future. I told her how proud I was, not just for surviving, but for choosing to help others, for turning her pain into a source of empathy and support for those still trapped in toxic relationships. The community's support had been overwhelming, and as word spread about the transformation of our old home, more people reached out to share their own stories of betrayal and family conflict, others to thank us for giving them hope that justice could be served, that karma really does find its way. I realized that our story had become more than just a pro-revenge tale or a satisfying story of payback. It was a beacon for anyone who'd ever felt powerless, anyone who'd ever wondered if it was possible to reclaim their life after being wronged. As the stars came out, Tiffany asked if I ever regretted any of it, giving so much, losing so much, fighting so hard for a family that had nearly destroyed itself. I thought about it for a long moment, then shook my head. No, I said quietly. Because every sacrifice, every painful lesson brought us here, and here, we're finally free. She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in years, I felt the simple, unbreakable bond of family restored. Not perfect, not untouched by pain, but real and earned. Before we went inside, I turned to her and said, "You know, Tiffany, sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't about what you do to others. It's about what you build for yourself after the storm." She nodded, understanding, and together we closed the door on the past, ready to face whatever came next. But the story didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, the impact of our choices rippled through the community in ways I never could have predicted. The Veterans Housing Initiative invited us to their open house, where we met the families who now called our old place home. I watched as children played in the yard where Tiffany once ran barefoot, their laughter echoing off the walls that had witnessed so much pain and healing. One of the veterans, a single mother named Maria, pulled me aside and thanked me for giving her children a safe place to grow up. Her gratitude was humbling, and I realized that the legacy of our family drama had been transformed into something good, something lasting. Tiffany volunteered to help Maria's kids with their homework, and I found myself fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen, the same way I used to for Tiffany and Harry. It was a strange, beautiful kind of closure, a reminder that even the most painful chapters of our lives can become the foundation for someone else's new beginning. As the seasons changed, so did our lives. Tiffany continued her work with the support group, sharing her story of betrayal, broken trust, and ultimate redemption with others who needed to hear it. She became a source of strength for women escaping toxic relationships, her experience a living testament to the power of emotional storytelling and importance of setting boundaries. I started writing down my own story, hoping that one day it might help someone else find the courage to stand up for themselves, to demand justice, and to believe that karma will eventually catch up to those who cause harm. Our relationship, once fractured by years of family conflict and generational pain, grew stronger with every honest conversation, every shared memory, every new tradition we created together. One evening, as we watched the sunset over the lake, Tiffany turned to me and said, "Dad, do you think we'll ever forget what happened?" I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. "No, sweetheart. But I think we'll learn to live with it. And maybe, just maybe, we'll be better for it." She smiled, and I saw in her eyes the same resilience that had carried us through the darkest days. We sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after a storm has passed, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons learned, for the justice served, and for the chance to start again. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think this revenge was fair, or did they deserve even worse? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story satisfying, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional storytelling, pro-revenge, and true family conflict Kayleys. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the most powerful justice is simply living well and refusing to let betrayal define your future. The weeks after the open house at the Veterans Housing Initiative brought a new rhythm to my life, one that felt both unfamiliar and deeply comforting. Each morning, I'd wake to the sound of birdsong and a gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, a far cry from the tension and raised voices that had once filled my days. Tiffany had started coming by more often, sometimes with a casserole or a stack of books for the kids at the veterans' home, sometimes just to sit with me in companionable silence. Our conversations grew deeper, more honest, as we unpacked the layers of family drama that had shaped us both. She told me about her counseling sessions, about the moments when she'd wanted to give up, and about the small victories that kept her moving forward. I shared my own struggles, the nights I'd lain awake, haunted by memories of betrayal and broken trust, the anger that had threatened to consume me, and the slow, steady process of letting go. We talked about Martha, about the way she'd always believed in second chances, and about the legacy she'd left us, not just a house or a set of traditions, but a belief in the power of forgiveness and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. The community continued to rally around us, their support a constant reminder that we were not alone in our journey. Neighbors dropped off homemade bread and fresh vegetables. Old friends invited us to church picnics and community events, and even strangers reach out after hearing our story, sharing their own tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the long road to justice served. It was humbling to realize how many people had been touched by our experience. How many had found hope in our willingness to confront the past and build something new. The veterans' families became a part of our extended circle, their children running through the yard, their laughter a daily reminder that healing was possible. Maria, the single mother who thanked me at the open house, became a close friend, her resilience and optimism inspiring both Tiffany. We spent weekends helping her with repairs around the house, organizing community potlucks, and sharing stories of survival and redemption. The house that had once been a symbol of pain and loss was now a place of joy and connection, a testament to the power of transformation and the enduring strength of the human spirit. But even as life settled into this new, hopeful pattern, the echoes of the past were never far away. There were moments when a certain song on the radio or a familiar scent would bring back memories of Harry's betrayal, of the toxic relationship that had nearly destroyed our family. Tiffany struggled with guilt, sometimes questioning whether she deserved the happiness she was beginning to find. I reassured her, reminding her that everyone makes mistakes, that what mattered was the courage to face them and the determination to do better. We talked about the importance of boundaries, about the lessons we'd learned from our ordeal, and about the need to protect ourselves from those who would take advantage of our kindness. I encouraged her to keep sharing her story, to use her experience to help others escape the cycle of emotional abuse and family conflict. She took my advice to heart, speaking at local support groups and in writing articles for the community newsletter, her words resonating with those who had suffered in silence for too long. Her journey became a beacon for others, a living example of how even the deepest wounds could be healed with time, honesty, and support. As autumn turned to winter, the lake froze over and the world grew quiet, blanketed in snow. Tiffany and I spent long evenings by the fire, reflecting on the year that had changed everything. We talked about the future, about the possibility of new beginnings, and about the legacy we wanted to leave for the next generation. I realized that our story was no longer just about revenge or justice served. It was about hope, resilience, and the power of family to overcome even the greatest challenges. The pain of betrayal would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined us. Instead, it had become a part of our story, a reminder of how far we'd come and how much we'd grown. One night, as we watched the snow fall outside, Tiffany turned to me and said, "Dad, do you think Mom would be proud of us?" I smiled, feeling Martha's presence and the warmth of the fire, and the love that filled the room. "I think she'd be proud of how we found our way back to each other," I said. "And, how we turned our pain into something good." Tiffany nodded, her eyes shining with tears, and I knew that we were finally at peace. But as the new year approached, a letter arrived in the mail, its return address unfamiliar. Inside was a simple note: "Your story inspired me. I'm ready to take my life back too." It was signed by a woman from a neighboring town, someone who had heard Tiffany speak at a support group. As I read her words, I realized that our journey was far from over. There were still stories to be told, still lives to be changed, and still hope to be shared. And as I looked at Tiffany, I knew that together we were ready for whatever came next. The letter from the neighboring town was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more messages arrived: emails, handwritten notes, even a few phone calls from people who had seen Tiffany's articles or heard her speak at support groups. Each story was different, but the themes were heartbreakingly familiar. Betrayal by a loved one, the suffocating grip of toxic relationships, the pain of family conflict that left scars deeper than any physical wound. Some wrote about cheating spouses, others about workplace betrayal or generational conflict that had torn their families apart. Many simply wanted to thank us for sharing our story, for proving that justice could be served and that it was possible to reclaim your life after years of emotional turmoil. Tiffany read every message, sometimes crying, sometimes smiling, always responding with compassion and encouragement. She began to realize that her journey was part of something much larger, a network of survivors, each one fighting their own battle, each one searching for hope and validation. I watched her grow into her new role, her confidence blossoming as she helped others find their voice. She organized a community event at the local library, inviting speakers to share their own pro-revenge stories and lessons learned from family drama. The turnout was larger than anyone expected, with people traveling from neighboring towns to listen, share, and support one another. The room was filled with laughter, tears, and the kind of raw honesty that only comes from those who have truly suffered and survived. I sat in the back, listening as Tiffany spoke about her own journey, about the day she realized she had to choose between loyalty to Harry and loyalty to herself, about the pain of broken trust, and about the slow, difficult process of rebuilding her life. Her words resonated with the audience, many of whom lined up afterward to thank her, to share their own stories, or simply to hug her and say, "Me too." The event sparked a movement in our small town. Support groups grew, new friendships formed, and the stigma around family conflict and emotional abuse began to fade. People who had once suffered in silence now found the courage to speak out, to demand justice, and to seek help. The local paper ran a series of articles on the importance of setting boundaries, recognizing toxic relationships, and the power of community in healing old wounds. I was asked to contribute my own perspective, and I wrote about the lessons I'd learned, the importance of self-respect, the necessity of letting go, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing karma do its work. My story, once a private tale of pain and revenge, became a source of hope for others, a reminder that even the most devastating betrayals can be overcome with time, honesty, and support. The veterans' families continued to thrive in their old home, their children growing up surrounded by love and stability. Maria, the single mother who had become our friend, started her own support group for military spouses, drawing on her own experiences of loss and resilience. Tiffany volunteered to help, and together they created a network of resources for families in crisis, offering everything from counseling referrals to emergency housing. The house that had once been a symbol of pain and loss was now a beacon of hope, its walls echoing with laughter and the promise of new beginnings. As winter melted into spring, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. The pain of betrayal was still there, a scar that would never fully fade, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it had become a part of my story, a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I'd grown. Tiffany and I spent more time together than ever before, our relationship stronger and more honest than I could have imagined. We talked about the future, about the possibility of new adventures, and about the legacy we wanted to leave for those who came after us. One afternoon, as we walked along the lake, Tiffany turned to me and said, "Dad, do you think we'll ever stop helping people?" I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. I hope not, I replied. Because every time we help someone else, we heal a little more ourselves. She smiled, and I knew she understood. Our story was no longer just about revenge or justice served. It was about hope, resilience, and the power of community to transform even the darkest chapters of our lives. But as the gaze grew longer and the world burst into bloom, a new challenge appeared on the horizon. One that would test everything we had learned and force us to confront the limits of forgiveness and the true meaning of family. The new challenge arrived in the form of a phone call late one evening, just as Tiffany and I were finishing dinner. The number was unfamiliar, but something in my gut told me to answer. On the other end was a trembling voice from Harry's mother, Evelyn, a woman I'd only met a handful of times at family gatherings, always polite but distant, her eyes shadowed by worry. She explained that she'd heard about everything that had happened, the family drama that had played out so publicly, and she was calling not to defend her son, but to ask for help. Harry, she said, had been released from jail early for good behavior, but he was struggling homeless, jobless, and spiraling deeper into addiction and despair. Evelyn's voice broke as she described how he'd burned every bridge, alienated every friend, and now had nowhere left to turn. She admitted that she'd enabled him for years, always hoping he'd change, always believing that family meant never giving up, no matter how many times he'd betrayed their trust. But now she was at her wits' end, afraid that if someone didn't intervene, Harry might not survive the winter. The call left me shaken, torn between the satisfaction of seeing karma finally catch up to Harry and the old, familiar ache of compassion that had once driven me to sacrifice everything for my family. Tiffany listened quietly as I recounted the conversation, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. "What do we do, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do we help him after everything he's done?" It was a question I'd never wanted to face, a test of forgiveness that went beyond any pro-revenge story or satisfying tale of justice served. I spent the night wrestling with my conscience, replaying every moment of betrayal, every act of cruelty, every time Harry had tried to destroy the life I'd built. But I also remembered the lessons I'd learned, the importance of boundaries, the necessity of letting go, and the quiet power of choosing hope over bitterness. The next morning I called Evelyn back. I told her that while I couldn't welcome Harry back into my home or my life, I would help her find resources, rehab programs, job placement services, and a safe place for him to stay if he was willing to accept help. Tiffany agreed to join me, her resolve strengthened by the knowledge that true healing sometimes meant extending a hand, even to those who had hurt us most. Together, we met with Evelyn at a local cafe, the air thick with unspoken pain and tentative hope. She thanked us through tears, her gratitude genuine and raw. We spent hours making calls, filling out paperwork, and connecting Harry with the support he needed. It wasn't easy. He resisted at first, angry and defensive, blaming everyone but himself for his situation. But slowly, with time and persistence, he began to accept the help offered. It was a long, difficult process, filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. But it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of family to heal even after the deepest wounds. As the weeks passed, Harry began to change. He found steady work through a local veterans program, started attending counseling, and even reached out to Tiffany with a letter of apology. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of anger, still scars that would never fully heal, but it was a start. Tiffany and I watched from a distance, proud of the boundaries we'd set and the growth we'd achieved, but also grateful for the chance to see redemption in action. Our story, once defined by betrayal and revenge, had become something more, a lesson in forgiveness, a testament to the strength of family, and a reminder that even the most broken relationships could be mended with time, honesty, and support. But just as we began to settle into this new chapter, another letter arrived. This one from the lawyer representing Harry's cruisers, threatening legal action if old debts weren't paid. The past, it seemed, was not so easily left behind, and we were about to face one final test of our resolve and unity. The letter from the lawyer was a cold reminder that the consequences of betrayal and toxic relationships can echo for years, long after the initial wounds have begun to heal. It arrived on a gray, blustery afternoon, the kind of day that seemed to invite old ghosts back into the room. The envelope was thick, the return address from the law firm in the city, and as I opened it, my hands trembled with a mixture of dread and resignation. Inside was a formal demand for payment of thousands of dollars in unpaid debts, all tied to Harry's reckless spending and fraudulent loans. The letter threatened legal action, wage garnishment, and even the possibility of a lien on the house I donated to the Veterans Housing Initiative. My first reaction was a surge of anger, a familiar heat rising in my chest as I thought about all the years I'd spent cleaning up Harry's messes. All the sacrifices I'd made for a man who had never shown an ounce of gratitude. But as I read through the details, I realized that this was more than just a financial threat. It was a test of everything Tiffany and I had learned about boundaries, self-respect, and the true meaning of justice served. I called Tiffany, my voice steady but tight, and explained the situation. She listened in silence, her breathing shallow, and when I finished, she simply said, "We're not paying. Dad, not this time." Her words were a revelation, a sign that she had finally broken free from the cycle of guilt and obligation that had defined so much of our family drama. Together, we sat down with a lawyer our own, gathering every document, every piece of evidence that proved we were not responsible for Harry's debts. We compiled bank statements, property records, and the paperwork from the Veterans Housing Initiative, building a case that was as much about reclaiming our dignity as it was about protecting our assets. The process was exhausting, a maze of phone calls, meetings, and legal jargon that seemed designed to wear us down. There were moments when I doubted our resolve, when the old urge to just pay the bills and make the problem go away threatened to overwhelm me. But Tiffany stood firm, reminding me of the lessons we'd learned, the importance of letting people face the consequences of their own actions, the necessity of drawing a line and refusing to cross it, no matter how much pressure we felt. Our lawyer was a godsend, patient and thorough, guiding us through each step and reassuring us that we were on solid ground. The creditors pushed back, sending more letters, making more threats, but we held our ground, refusing to be bullied or manipulated. The community rallied around us once again, offering support and encouragement, their faith in our strength a constant source of comfort. Even Maria and the other veterans' families offered to testify on our behalf, their gratitude for the home we'd given them a powerful reminder of the good that had come from our pain. As the weeks dragged on, the legal battle became a kind of crucible, burning away the last remnants of fear and self-doubt that had haunted us for so long. Tiffany and I grew closer than ever, our bond forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the knowledge that we had survived the worst together. We talked often about the nature of revenge, about the difference between justice and retribution, and about the quiet satisfaction that comes from standing up for yourself and refusing to be a victim. The case eventually went to mediation, and after hours of tense negotiation, the creditors agreed to drop their claims in exchange for a modest settlement, one that Harry himself would be responsible for paying. It was a victory not just in the legal sense, but in the emotional and spiritual sense as well. We had faced our demons, stood our ground, and urged stronger for it. But as we celebrated our hard-won freedom, another letter arrived, this one from Harry himself. It was short, handwritten, and filled with a humility I had never seen from him before. He apologized for the pain he had caused, for the years of betrayal and manipulation, and for the burden he had placed on our shoulders. He thanked us for helping him when he was at his lowest, and for refusing to let him drag us down any further. He promised to make amends, to pay his debts, and to rebuild his life one day at a time. Tiffany read the letter in silence, tears streaming down her face, and when she finished, she looked at me and said, "Maybe this is what real justice looks like, Dad. Not revenge, not payback, but the chance for everyone to start over." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my heart, and realized that our story was finally coming full circle. But as we put the letter away, the phone rang again, this time with news that would change everything and test our newfound peace in ways we never could have imagined. The phone call that followed Harry's letter came late in the evening, just as Tiffany and I were settling in for a quiet night, the kind we'd come to cherish after so many years of chaos. The number was from the local hospital, and the voice on the other end was calm but urgent. Harry had been admitted after collapsing at work, the result of a combination of exhaustion, untreated health issues, and the lingering effects of his years of addiction and stress. The nurse explained that he was stable but weak, and that he'd listed both Tiffany and me as his emergency contacts. For a moment, I felt the old anger flare up, the instinct to turn away from the man who had caused us so much pain. But as I listened to the nurse describe Harry's condition, I realized that this was another test not just of forgiveness, but of the boundaries we'd worked so hard to build. Tiffany's face was pale, her hands trembling as she'd listened to the details. "What do we do, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought about all the revenge stories I'd read, all the tales of karma and justice served, and I knew that this was the moment that would define us not as victims, not as avengers, but as people who had learned the true meaning of compassion and self-respect. We agreed to visit Harry in the hospital, not out of obligation or guilt, but because we wanted to see for ourselves that he was safe, and to make it clear that while we wished him well, our lives would no longer revolve around his needs or his crises. The hospital was quiet when we arrived, the halls dimly lit and filled with the soft hum of machines and the distant murmur of nurses. Harry looked smaller than I remembered, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. But there was a flicker of recognition and gratitude when he saw us. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with long silences and hesitant words, but gradually the walls began to come down. Harry apologized again, this time with a sincerity that felt real, not just another attempt at manipulation. He spoke about the pain of losing everything, the shame of facing his own failures, and the slow, difficult process of trying to rebuild his life from the ground up. Tiffany listened quietly, her expression a mixture of sadness and relief, and when Harry finished, she simply said, "I hope you find peace, Harry, but we can't save you. You have to do that yourself." I echoed her words, telling Harry that while we wished him well, we would no longer be responsible for his choices or consequences. It was a hard conversation, but it was also a liberating one, a final act of closure that allowed us to move forward without regret or resentment. As we left the hospital, Tiffany squeezed my hand and said, "I'm proud of us, Dad. We did the right thing." I nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over me, and realized that this was what true justice looked like, not revenge, not payback, but the freedom to live our lives on our own terms, unburdened by the past. The days that followed were filled with a quiet joy, the kind that comes from knowing you've faced your demons and come out stronger on the other side. We spent more time with the veterans' families, helping them with projects around the house, organizing community events, and sharing our story with anyone who needed to hear it. The support group Tiffany had started continued to grow, attracting people from all walks of life, survivors of family conflict, victims of workplace betrayal, and those struggling to break free from toxic relationships. Each meeting was a reminder of how far we'd come, and how much good could come from even the most painful experiences. But just as we began to settle into this new chapter, another challenge appeared on the horizon. The Veterans Housing Initiative, grateful for our ongoing support, invited us to speak at a regional conference on family healing and community resilience. It was an incredible honor, but also a daunting responsibility. Tiffany was nervous, unsure if she was ready to share her story on such a large stage. But I encouraged her, reminding her of the lives she'd already touched and the strength she'd found in her own journey. Together, we prepared our presentation, weaving in the lessons we'd learned about boundaries, forgiveness, and the power of community to heal even the deepest wounds. As the day of the conference approached, we felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety, knowing that our story was about to reach a whole new audience. And as we stood backstage, Waiting for our turn to speak, I looked at Tiffany and realized that no matter what happened next, we had already won. But as the lights dimmed and our names were called, I felt a surge of nerves. One last test. One last chance to turn our pain into purpose. And to prove that even the most broken families can find their way back to hope. The day of the conference dawned bright and clear, the kind of morning that seemed to promise new beginnings. Tiffany and I arrived early, our nerves masked by the careful preparation we'd poured into our presentation. The regional conference center was bustling with people. Social workers, counselors, veterans, survivors of family conflict, and advocates for emotional storytelling and community healing. Banners hung from the ceiling, each one emblazoned with words like resilience, justice served, and hope after betrayal. As we checked in, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me, the old fear of judgment and exposure threatening to undermine my confidence. But Tiffany squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with determination, and I knew we were ready. We spent the morning attending workshops, listening to stories of workplace betrayal, generational conflict, and a long winding road to forgiveness. Each speaker brought their own perspective, their own scars, and their own hard-won wisdom. I was struck by the diversity of experiences, the universality of pain, and the incredible strength it took for each person to stand up and share their truth. It was a reminder that our story, while unique in its details, was part of a much larger tapestry of a network of survivors and healers, each one doing their part to break the cycle of silence and shame. When it was finally our turn to speak, Tiffany and I walked onto the stage together, the bright lights momentarily blinding. The room was packed, every seat filled, and the air buzzed with anticipation. I took a deep breath, glanced at Tiffany, and began. I spoke first, sharing the early days of our family drama, the sacrifices I'd made, the trust I'd placed in Harry, and the slow, painful realization that my generosity had been mistaken for weakness. I talked about the heartbreak of betrayal, the humiliation of being cast out of my own home, and the anger that had threatened to consume me. But I also spoke about the turning point the moment I decided to fight back, to reclaim my dignity, and to let karma do its work. I described the steps I'd taken, the revenge plan that had unfolded with quiet precision, and the satisfaction of seeing justice served not through violence or rage, but through patience, boundaries, and the unwavering support of my community. Tiffany took over from there, her voice steady but emotional, as she recounted her own journey. The toxic relationship with Harry, the guilt and shame of enabling his behavior, and the long, difficult process of breaking free. She spoke about the support group she'd started, the women she'd helped, and the lessons she'd learned about self-respect, forgiveness, and the power of telling your story. The audience listened in rapt silence, many nodding in recognition, others wiping away tears. When we finished, the applause was overwhelming. People lined up to thank us, to share their own stories of betrayal and healing, and to ask for advice on how to navigate their own family contexts. Social workers approached us with invitations to speak at other events. Counselors asked for permission to share our story with their clients. And survivors of all ages expressed gratitude for our honesty and vulnerability. It was humbling and exhilarating, a validation of everything we'd endured, and the testament to the power of emotional storytelling to change lives. As the conference continued, Tiffany and I made new friends, forged new connections, and found ourselves at the center of a growing movement for justice, healing, and community support. We exchanged contact information with advocates from across the region, brainstormed ideas for future workshops, and even began planning a podcast to share more pro-revenge stories and lessons learned from our journey. But as the day drew to a close and we prepared to head home, a woman approached us with a look of urgency in her eyes. She introduced herself as a journalist from a national magazine, explaining that she'd been moved by our presentation and wanted to feature our story in an upcoming issue on family resilience and the power of community. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying, the chance to reach an even wider audience to inspire others, but also the risk of reopening old wounds and exposing ourselves to public scrutiny on a scale we'd never imagined. Tiffany looked at me, her expression a mixture of excitement and apprehension, and I knew we had another decision to make. We agreed to meet with the journalist to share our story one more time, but as we left the conference center and stepped into the cool evening air, I couldn't help but wonder what new challenges and opportunities lay ahead. The journey that had begun with betrayal and broken trust was far from over, and as we drove home under a sky full of stars, I realized that the most satisfying stories are the ones that keep evolving, offering new chances for growth, connection, and hope. The days leading up to the magazine interview were a whirlwind of preparation, nerves, and reflection. Tiffany and I spent hours talking through every detail of our story, making sure we were ready to share not just the facts, but the emotions, the lessons, and the raw truth behind our journey from betrayal to healing. The journalist, a woman named Rachel, arrived at my cabin on a crisp Saturday morning, her notepad in hand in a gentle, empathetic manner that immediately put us at ease. She asked thoughtful questions, not just about the dramatic moments, the ultimatum, the eviction, the pro-revenge plan, but about the quieter struggles, the sleepless nights, the doubts, the moments when forgiveness seems impossible. Tiffany spoke candidly about the toxic relationship with Harry, the family conflict that had nearly destroyed her, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding trust with me and with herself. I shared my own perspective, describing the years of sacrifice, the heartbreak of broken trust, and the satisfaction of finally seeing justice served, not through anger or retribution, but through boundaries, community support, and the courage to walk away from toxic relationships. Rachel listened intently, occasionally wiping away a tear, and promised to honor our story with honesty and respect. She asked about the aftermath, the ripple effect our choices had on the community, the veterans' families who now thrived in our old home, and the support group Tiffany had started for survivors of emotional abuse and family drama. We talked about the conference, the connections we'd made, and the growing movement for healing and justice that had sprung up around us. Rachel was particularly interested in the generational conflict that had shaped our family, the way old wounds and unspoken expectations had set the stage for betrayal, and the way breaking the cycle had required both courage and humility. She asked about Martha, about the legacy she'd left us, and about the ways her memory had guided us through the darkest days. Tiffany and I both grew emotional as we described the moments when we'd felt her presence, the times when her wisdom and love had helped us find our way back to each other. The interview lasted most of the day, and by the time Rachel packed up her things and said goodbye, we felt both exhausted and exhilarated. She promised to send us a draft of the article before it went to print, and as we watched her car disappear down the driveway, Tiffany turned to me and said, "Do you think we're ready for this, Dad? For the whole world to know our story?" I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "I think we're ready, sweetheart. Because if our story can help even one person find the strength to leave a toxic relationship, or to stand up for themselves in the face of betrayal, then it's worth it." That night, we sat by the fire talking about the future. We brainstormed ideas for the podcast, discussed plans for more community events, and even considered writing a book together as a guide for others navigating the minefield of family conflict, pro-revenge, and the long road to healing. The possibilities felt endless, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly hopeful about what lay ahead. A few weeks later, the magazine arrived in the mail. Our story featured on the cover under the headline, "From Betrayal to Hope, One Family's Journey Through Conflict, Revenge, and Redemption." The article was beautifully written, capturing not just the drama and pain, but the resilience, the growth, and the power of community to heal even the deepest wounds. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters and emails poured in from across the country, survivors of family drama, victims of workplace betrayal, people struggling with generational conflict, all reaching out to thank us for sharing our truth. Some asked for advice, others simply wanted to say, "You gave me hope." Tiffany and I read every message, responding as best we could, and found ourselves at the center of a national conversation about justice served, karma, and the importance of emotional storytelling and breaking the cycle of silence and shame. But with the attention came new challenges. Not everyone was supportive. Some criticized us for airing our family's dirty laundry. Others questioned our motives or accused us of seeking fame. There were moments when the scrutiny felt overwhelming, when the old doubts and insecurities threatened to resurface. But through it all, Tiffany and I leaned on each other, reminding ourselves of the lives we'd touched, the people we'd helped, and the strength we'd found in telling our story. We continued our work in the community, expanding the support group, launching the podcast, and speaking at events across the region. Our story, once a private tale of pain and revenge, had become a beacon for others. A reminder that even the most devastating betrayals can be overcome with time, honesty, and support. As spring turned to summer and the world burst into bloom, Tiffany and I found ourselves busier than ever, our days filled with new projects, new connections, and new opportunities to make a difference. But as we prepared for our next big event, a national conference on family healing and justice, I received a letter that stopped me in my tracks. It was from Harry. The letter from Harry was unexpected. Its arrival, both a jolt and a strange relief. The envelope was plain, the handwriting shaky, but unmistakably his. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening it, the weight of years of family conflict, betrayal, and broken trust pressing down on me. Tiffany joined me, her expression wary but resolute, and together we unfolded the pages. Harry's words were different this time. There was no blame, no anger, no attempt to manipulate or justify. Instead, he wrote with a humility and vulnerability I'd never seen from him before. He described the months since his hospitalization, the slow, painful work of recovery, and the daily struggle to stay sober and rebuild what little remained of his life. He admitted to the pain he'd caused, not just to us but to his own mother, to the veterans' families who'd lost their home because of his actions, and to himself. "I know I can never undo what I did," he wrote, "but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. I'm working on paying my debts, and I'm finally facing the truth about who I was and what I became." He thanked us for the boundaries we'd set, for refusing to enable him any longer, and for the help we'd given his mother when she needed it most. He apologized to Tiffany, acknowledging the years of emotional abuse, the lies, and the manipulation that had nearly destroyed her. "You deserved better," he wrote. "I hope you find happiness, and I hope you can forgive me not for my sake, but for yours." Tiffany read the letter in silence, tears streaming down her face, and when she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. "I don't know if I can ever forgive him, Dad," she said quietly, "but I think I can finally let go." I nodded, feeling a sense of closure settle over us. The last piece of a long, painful puzzle finally falling into place. We talked late into the night, reflecting on the journey that had brought us here, the betrayals, the revenge, the justice served, and the healing that had come not from payback, but from the courage to face the truth and the strength to move forward. Our story, once defined by pain and conflict, had become a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of boundaries, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing karma do its work in its own time. In the months that followed, life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The national attention from the magazine article and the podcast brought new opportunities for speaking engagements, collaborations with advocacy groups, and invitations to share our story with audiences across the country. Tiffany's support group flourished, helping countless women and men break free from toxic relationships and find their own paths to healing. The veterans' families continued to thrive, their children growing up in a home filled with laughter and love, a living legacy of the transformation that had begun with one painful ultimatum. I found joy in the simple things: fishing on the lake, tending the garden, and spending quiet evenings with Tiffany, grateful for the second chance we'd been given. As the anniversary of our first conference approached, Tiffany and I were invited to return as keynote speakers. We still SH together, looking out at a sea of faces of survivors, advocates, families, and friends, all united by the shared experience of pain and the hope of healing. I spoke about the lessons I'd learned. That revenge stories and tales of justice served are never really about the people who wronged us, but about the strength it takes to reclaim your life, to set boundaries, and to choose hope over bitterness. Tiffany shared her own wisdom, encouraging others to speak their truth, to seek help, and to believe that even the deepest wounds can become sources of strength. The applause was thunderous, but the real reward came afterward, in the quiet conversations with those whose lives had been changed by our story. As we drove home that night, Tiffany turned to me and said, "Do you think we'll ever stop telling this story?" I smiled, feeling the weight of the past finally lift. "I hope not," I replied. "Because every time we share it, we remind ourselves and others that healing is possible, that justice can be served, and that even the most broken families can find their way back to each other." We pulled into the driveway, the porch light glowing softly in the darkness, and I knew that our journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new stories, and new opportunities to help others. But for now, we were at peace, our hearts full, our family whole. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think this revenge was fair? Or did they deserve even worse? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story satisfying, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional storytelling, pro-revenge, and true family conflict tales. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the most powerful justice is simply living well and refusing to let betrayal define your future.